You are listening to the Yield to Reason podcast, where we strive to help you build the most important part of your retirement strategy. Because a retirement plan built with robust income sources is a retirement plan built for success. I am Brandon Roberts. This is episode number 8, and today we're addressing what many believe to be a very controversial topic. Should you buy an annuity? It's time to get serious about guaranteed income sources and fees as we set off on a journey to help you build the retirement you deserve and the one you actually want. So annuities tend to be a rather controversial subject for what seems to be some very strange reasons. There are a group of people who believe they're probably the single worst financial decision you could ever make. And then there's a crowd of people who think they are probably the best retirement asset ever created. So there is a wide divergence here. And despite all of the arguing and the bickering, annuities, they have existed for a long time. They continue to exist, and they're certainly not going to go away. So we're going to try and figure out what's good, what's bad, and whether or not annuities make any sense for you. Now, just looking at the numbers when it comes to annuities, what we find is data that supports the narrative that Americans are quite positive on the subject of annuities. In fact, 2024 annual sales of annuities were a little over $434 billion compared to 10 years prior. That's up from $229 billion. That's a 47% plus gain in annuity sales over that 10-year period. That's a lot. And comparatively, in 2024, total net inflows for long-term U.S. ETFs was $721 billion. So annuities comprise more than half of the net inflows going to ETFs, and ETFs enjoy a much broader availability in terms of platforms. You can buy them in a number of retirement plans very easily, and there is certainly a significantly higher ease with which individuals can buy in and sell out of ETFs on an array of different platforms. The process of purchasing an annuity is far, far more complicated, shall we say. So the fact that annuities still are bringing in annual sales numbers that are, again, a little more than half of what is net flowing into ETFs is a bit impressive, quite honestly. I expected the annuity sales to be less than that comparatively to ETFs, which have essentially become the retirement saving asset. Mutual funds are still around, and they're doing just fine. Don't get me wrong. But ETFs have become a much more favored platform given their wide availability and their constant tradability throughout the day. Now, I'm going to start this discussion right at the beginning by noting what some might think is a potential bias and or possibly conflict of interest of my own, to note that I have an insurance license. I've had one for a long time. I have sold annuities before. I've used my insurance license to put in place a lot more life insurance policies than annuity policies, but I have actively been in the retirement planning world for a long time and have absolutely sold annuities and have absolutely made money selling annuities. And I'm going to tell you right now that I think probably the biggest source of problem for annuities really comes from how broad a subject it is. When we say annuity, we like to pretend like it's one singular thing, but annuities encompass a couple of different possible situations or scenarios and are individually designed to tackle certain needs. So generally when we bring up annuities, income comes to mind, but not every single annuity out there is necessarily engineered to address the issue of income. It is no argument here the majority of applications for annuities, which is to say that most people out looking at annuities, most people out talking about annuities are definitely deeply grounded in the income discussion. But there are some annuities out there that really aren't all that intended as income sources. And I'm going to set those aside, but I'm just going to note that because of that broadness in terms of what annuity means in totality, I think there's a large degree of confusion, not just among the general consuming public. I actually think there's a decent amount of confusion housed within the supposed professionals that are out selling these products, be they just individually insurance licensed agents or financial advisors who also get an insurance license because they want to incorporate annuities into their practice. There is a bit of a knowledge gap that exists even among the professionals that leads to some problems. So the threat of buying the wrong annuity, it's certainly not zero. But I know that most of the opponents on the subject of annuities aren't so much focused on that idea. They're focused on something else, and I'm sure a number of you are expecting this to be the conversation. They're focused on the fees. And admittedly, there are a number of fees we can look at and tally up when it comes to certain styles of annuities that certainly seem extremely high. This is especially true when it comes to variable annuities. So these are annuities that take the cash value and they invest it in the market. And these annuities have a full disclosure of the fees that they charge. And in some cases, they are a bit eye-widening when you look at them. So generally speaking, they break down into three categories. We have what's called the mortality and expense fee. This essentially covers an insurance company's ability to guarantee that if you buy an annuity and the value of the annuity goes down because of the market and you die, the insurance company will pay whomever your beneficiary is at least the initial investment you made into the annuity. So for example, if you buy one of these annuities, start out with $100,000. There's a market correction. The cash value of the new annuity is $80,000. You pass away, the insurance company will pay your beneficiary $100,000 because that was the initial amount that you gave them. That is what is generally covered inside that mortality and expense, oftentimes called M&E expense on an annuity. And across the industry, that's usually something close to 1%. So 1% of the cash value deducted each and every single year covers this feature. And I know some of you might think, well, wait a minute, what happens if my underlying investments get to a point where now I've got like $200,000 inside the annuity? There's no risk to the insurance company that they're going to have to make up that difference anymore. Will the fee reduce or go away? No, it won't. So the next common fee is attached to various riders that would be part of the annuity. And the most common rider that gets added to a variable annuity is an income style rider. So this gives the annuity the ability to provide income without what we refer to as annuitization, which is the process of handing all of your money over to the insurance company and forfeiting it basically for a guaranteed income stream in return. So you don't have to do that when you have one of these riders. Instead, what you can do is start withdrawing a certain percentage from the value of the annuity and guarantee that withdrawal amount every single year for as long as you're alive, regardless of what happens to the cash in the annuity. So that could actually go to zero, but your ability to continue to withdraw this income benefit from the annuity, that remains in place. That rider is very common when it comes to a number of annuities, variable annuities, and it's also very common in types of indexed annuities. But the fee for that on variable annuities, it ranges a bit, but typical range is somewhere between like 1% and 3%. So that's on top of the mortality and expense fee that we already covered. Then the last expense that you'll find in a variable annuity is the investment account expense. So just like a mutual fund or an index fund that has an ongoing expense to the investment, the investment accounts inside a variable annuity, they have expenses too. So they are going to range depending on the investment style or investment choice. But again, ranges probably between 0.5% to 1.5%. So if we add that all up, we're talking about like 3 to 5% on average being deducted from your cash value of the annuity each and every single year for the benefit of having this variable annuity contract. That's a lot. It's just a lot. There is no attempt I'm going to make to save face on the sake of annuities here. That's expensive. It seems expensive, especially in the face of going out and buying, for example, an index fund or an indexed ETF where the expense ratio is probably something closer to like 0.25%, maybe 0.1%, in some cases even less than that. It's obvious that in comparison, the fee aspect here appears astronomical. Now, not all annuities that function in this way necessarily have fees to this degree. And there are certain styles of variable annuity that are lower cost. There are also indexed annuities that provide some of these same benefits, but they don't have a fee that is deducted from cash value each and every single year. So there are cheaper ways to accomplish a similar goal here, which means it's a little unfair to paint the entire marketplace of annuities into this narrow corner of, look at these fees that certain variable annuities have. This is damning to the entire annuity concept and why you shouldn't own one. But perhaps the whole fee thing is just a silly conversation from the outset. Because if we keep something important in mind about annuities, for the most part, the purchase is about income. Yes, I know I mentioned that there are some annuities that really aren't about income. We're not so much focused on those today. We're really wanting to talk about income in the sense of we're trying to build different sources of income, especially in retirement. This is why annuities come up. And if we look at this in the context of how much money am I committing to the cause of being able to guarantee a level of income, that certainly turns the conversation a little bit. And the fee side of it potentially becomes a little bit less significant. Now, when it comes to some of those other annuity products that don't have fees per se, they do most of the time have provisions that make the growth of the cash in the annuity relatively slow. They do this at the sacrifice of accumulating a certain income benefit, which does, in many respects, kind of back you into a corner of, if I purchase this annuity with the intention that I'm probably not going to take income from it or use it as an income source for maybe the next 10 years, the income benefit will grow. Many of them will guarantee that. Some will give you a guarantee plus some potential higher benefit, others less of a guarantee with a much more higher potential income benefit. There's a lot of variation here. But if after 10 years, I decide not to use this annuity for its intended sake as income, it's going to be really difficult to back away from this option, given the fact that I'll forfeit the income feature and what I'll walk away with cash-wise is not very good. So the important thing to keep in mind is that buying an annuity means that you are trying to establish an income stream that could be now, but it may also be in the future. And if you decide that that's not what you really wanted to do with that money sometime later, that's going to put you in a not so optimal situation. So backing out really needs to be quite a substantial circumstance in order to justify forfeiting what the income from the annuity was supposed to bring to the table. And that is frequently an area of contention for people who don't like annuities. But I do think that it's worth taking some time to think about how you are going to go about building different income sources and what degree of guarantee you're going to have within those income sources. And that's when annuities start to make a little more sense. That's not to say that annuities are a 100% solution. It more appropriately thought in terms of what sort of income do I need to guarantee and what sort of income is okay if it's flexible. And the last thing I do want to point out, just to be sure, about fees and annuities, be they variable annuities, be they indexed annuities with these income style riders on them, the fees that are assessed when they are generally do not impact the income benefit of the annuity. They only have an impact on the cash value that accumulates in the annuity. But despite the fees, and even the idea that you really got to commit to the cause of generating income if you're going to buy an annuity, there are certainly reasons that many Americans should take at least a good hard look at annuities. Doesn't mean they have to buy them. Just means that they really should be thinking about annuities, or at the very least, what annuities do, and trying to replicate that if they're not going to buy an annuity. Let me give you some statistics about retirement income, average retirement income in the United States. Not surprisingly, 45% roughly of the average retirement income created in America is comprised from Social Security. So if we look at the average American and how they're going about creating income, 45% of that income is coming from Social Security. Now, stunningly, the next largest category of income generation for retirees is earned wages. It's about 21% of the income that they have in retirement. 15% of all retirees work, at least part-time, to generate income for their retirement. That doesn't mean they're saving money for retirement. It means they are basically at a point where they have retired from whatever their career was, but they are continuing to work in order to have money they need to live and meet their income needs. Now, here's another stunner. 16.5% of that income is supported by pension plans. So even still today, with pensions appearing long since dead, the average income for retirees in the United States still has a fairly large percentage coming from pension plans. Then it scales down considerably from there. We get to investment brokerage, passive income, representing under 10%, and the smallest percentage of them all, less than 5% of the income generated on average from Americans comes from their defined contribution retirement plan, their 401k, their IRA, that sort of source. I've said it before. I'll say it again. I'll probably say it next week and the week after that. Americans hate living off their savings. If there is one data point that is consistent among all the retirement research that is done about the United States and retired Americans, it is simply that they do not have a comfort nor a very strong willingness to create income from their savings when it is comprised of investments that they hold. They don't like selling those things to create income to live. It's just not something they're all that comfortable with. Furthermore, research from JP Morgan and the American Council of Life Insurers both show us that retirees with more guaranteed income sources spend more money in retirement and they feel more confident about their retirement. Research from JP Morgan shows us that individuals who have income that is supported by an annuity will spend typically 20 to 40% more in retirement if they're middle class, and upper middle class 40+% more when they have income that is supported by an annuity. Research from BlackRock shows us that retirees who own an annuity that is currently providing them income state significant reductions in worry about outliving their assets and worry when it comes to day-to-day expenses. And that reduction is something like 70% across the board, both for outliving assets and worrying about day-to-day expenses. But one of the most, I would argue the most interesting data point on the subject of researching retirement and looking at how annuities play a role in the task of creating income is how retirees from the education sector specifically compare to other employment sectors in the United States. Education's an interesting one because for whatever reason, this employment sector has long concentrated a big percentage of retirement assets in annuities, thanks primarily to TIAA-CREF. The data there shows us that those enrolled in an annuity-focused plan have a significantly higher savings rate. Nearly 90% of all eligible participants participate in their retirement plan versus the general population, where only 59% of eligible participants actually participate in the plan. And I can also tell you from experience that the yield you can achieve, if you're thinking about this as yield to cost on annuities, in a lot of cases is extremely high relative to a number of other investment choices one could select in the pursuit of creating retirement income. So there is absolutely a case to be made for annuities. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that there's a problem that comes up with mismatching the right annuity to the right situation. And we find people often are dissatisfied with an annuity purchase, or at least the presentation of an annuity purchase, because they're simply being shown the wrong thing or being recommended the wrong thing. The complexity in terms of the broadness of the annuity marketplace is intimidating. There's no way around it. If you're a layperson trying to look at annuities and figure out what's available and what makes sense, there's a lot of unique nomenclature to the insurance industry that is not common vernacular inside the investment world. So you got to learn a whole new set of jargon that is going to take some time to get through for those who really like to get deep into the details. And there are, for sure, a number of insurance agents out there who believe there has never been a better financial product ever created than annuities, and everybody should own one and ideally should put all of their money in one. And that is simply not the case. Annuities are not the 100% solution. They're not even a good idea for some people. They are best thought of as a way of creating guaranteed income to cover non-discretionary income sources. So think of it like this. When you are planning income in retirement, you're going to have a certain amount of fixed income needs that I would dub non-discretionary. These are things that are never going to go away. These are things that you are always going to have to meet each and every single month. These would look like maybe your utility bill or your property tax bill if you own your own home. These are things that you will have to be able to cover month after month, and there is no paying them off. Then you have a certain amount of discretionary expenses. These are things that you kind of do for fun. These are things that maybe you can make adjustments to. So for example, you might say, hey, look, every Friday night, I like to go out to dinner with my wife and we go to a movie. Well, if times really got tough, if there was a bad economic crash and your account balances went down and your assets weren't able to support the same sort of income lifestyle you were accustomed to, there's a chance you could probably just stay in and watch Netflix. So that's how we differentiate this discretionary versus non-discretionary income. Now, when it comes to the non-discretionary income, there is certainly Social Security, and that is going to cover a big portion of non-discretionary income. But for a very large percentage of Americans, Social Security alone won't meet the entire need when it comes to non-discretionary income. This is where annuities shine extremely bright. You can fill in that difference with annuities and guarantee a level of income. And what you find in this case is you probably don't need to put nearly as much money into an annuity as some people might suggest you do, but you do it because you have some additional income to meet these fixed, have to pay them expenses and not worry about income that's coming from sources that could potentially fluctuate more in more volatile economic conditions. Now, there are always going to be some people who are very risk averse and they want much more than just their non-discretionary income sources to be supported by guaranteed income. And they may choose to purchase much more annuity income, even for the things that they have some flexibility over, because They just like the solid guarantee of income. That's fine. Those people are probably not in the majority, but they exist. And then on the flip side of all this, there are absolutely a group of people who are very comfortable managing their own assets. They like the DIY nature of investment management for themselves. They find various yielding assets and they choose those, and they produce substantial enough income in excess of what they need to not have to worry about changing economic conditions that might mean their net income month over month might change a little bit, because there's enough margin in their income need versus their income capacity to cover their need regardless of fluctuation. And those people do not need to buy an annuity. It's that simple. But a couple things to think about on the subject of whether or not you should buy an annuity, whether or not you need an annuity. There are some things that they systematize and automate and simplify for your retirement life. So managing your own assets is great. That's one of the reasons I have this podcast, to help people in that process. But some of you might decide at some point that you don't want to do that anymore. One option is to find an advisor who will manage the account for you and continue to produce income as you were, so that you can continue to live your life in retirement. That is possible. It's a little bit trickier to do because not a ton of financial advisors are necessarily focused intently on the task of managing a portfolio for the sake of income creation. It takes a little bit more hands-on approach, and so it's not as widely available, but they are out there. They're certainly out there. So that's one option. The other one is annuities, to hand off the task of managing the income distribution and just getting a guaranteed check, essentially, from an insurance company each and every single month. There is no right answer. It really comes down to how you feel about the task of managing the money yourself, or if you're going to hand it off to someone else, how exactly you're going to do that. Ideally, I think the model that I would use, this is the one that I advocate for when people ask my opinion most of the time. I would look at, again, the non-discretionary versus discretionary income. I would cover non-discretionary income with annuity income to the degree that Social Security doesn't totally meet the need. And beyond that, for the discretionary stuff, I would tend to favor things like closed-end funds or REITs or a covered call type strategy. Any other dividend-producing options, fine. Some people like master limited partnerships. That's totally fine if you like to wrap your head around that. Real estate is something that is harder to do if you're trying to do it casually, but if you have a passion, go ahead. That discretionary side is where I would tend to fill that in. Some of that may be managed by you. Some of that could be managed by an advisor if that's the way you want to set it up. That's all fine. But annuities really slide into the area of that gap between what Social Security can cover on the non-discretionary side, and then they don't really have to bridge into the more optional income aspect unless you want them to. And if you do, you do. And there's nothing wrong with that. The fee side of it really doesn't matter when you're trying to establish an income. It just doesn't. So you have to look at annuities and value them by the income they can produce and whether or not that meets the goal that you have in front of you. And if it's even conceivable with the money that you have set earmarked for the sake of buying an annuity. Now, if you fall deep into the DIY camp, and you really hate the idea of having to work with some other person to transact any sort of investment or savings plan, annuities are going to leave you frustrated because you really can't DIY annuities. So if you're going to go down that road, you're going to work with an agent somewhere, somehow, who's going to set you up with an annuity policy to then create income. And you're probably going to lean on that person even after the purchase for some administrative tasks. That's just the way they work. And if you really like sort of managing everything from a zoomed out view inside your brokerage account at whichever company you choose, again, annuities are going to potentially be a little problematic for you. But there is a large marketplace of annuities with a number of very unique and I would even argue impressive income aspects that you probably don't want to write off until you've thoroughly investigated what's available to you. Because even if you really enjoy managing your own accounts and you're doing a good job at it, you might find there are some annuities that can add benefit to the overall cause of income yield for you. That's everything for me today. But of course, have no fear, I'll be back next week with more tips and tricks in my never-ending pursuit of helping you establish a rock-solid retirement income. And of course, never forget, real wealth doesn't just add up, it writes checks.